for part 2 of Aaron Tuckey's climate series presentation. So for those of you who might not have attended the first session 2 weeks ago, Aaron Tuckey was our special guest and he presented on Welcome to the Anthropocene, Introduction to Climate Science and Sustainability Science, and it was a really great night. I think you were mostly all here, you all were very familiar. But it was really awesome, and obviously it's brought here tonight thanks to Field Preservation Groups. They partnered with us to help deliver tonight and this special evening. If any of you are interested in joining Field Preservation Group or wanted to check out the group and the work they've been doing, they have got a bit of an information stall up the back where they're actually showcasing some of the plastics that came out of their sea bins. So they've recently just installed the sea bins in the major ocean marina. So if you're interested in seeing some of the collections up the back, they're just on the table up there. So feel free to have a look. There's some really strange things you probably wouldn't think would get collected in the ocean marina, but it's there. So just for health and safety, the toilets are through the blue doors up the back, so just turn to your right once you go out the big doors. And in case there's an emergency or we need to evacuate, we'll head out the doors on our left here through the Tuckey room doors. And tea and coffee up the back, there's also water up there now. We will have some catering delivered later on for some snacks and networking, so feel free to hang around for that as well. A bit of an introduction to Aaron. So he's been studying in Sweden and he's bringing his knowledge and some of his studies back here to chat to you guys about Mandra and some of the bigger impacts that are happening worldwide and what we can do. Without more or less to do, I will introduce you to Aaron. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for turning up tonight. I see quite a lot of familiar faces, but there are also some new faces, I think. So I'd just be curious to know who did attend my talk 2 weeks ago. If you could just quickly raise your hand. Okay, that will make life a little bit easier. And I can skip through some of the introductory stuff to some extent. If I am a new face to you here tonight, you'll probably notice that I'm quite young. You're probably used to hearing a lot of professors talk about sustainability science and climate change. Unfortunately, it's not very possible to be both young and a professor. And I think that there's a lot of interesting input that the next generation has in discussing sustainability science and climate change. I realized very quickly through the work and studies that I'm doing that I know more than the average person, at least, about this. In fact, I know quite a bit now. And I wanted to start to share that in a way with my local community, basically to talk about some of these global problems and how they affect us locally. I work with Education for Sustainable Development, so I run a lot of workshops and I do a lot of this kind of interactive learning experience work as well, but I also do a lot of research work tonight. And so in my presentation tonight, we're going to probably go a little bit more onto my research side, so I'll be talking more from the stuff that I've had quite a lot of experience with. In our last talk, we were more general, I would say. How does this look for tonight? Well, last week we talked a lot, or last session 2 weeks ago, we talked about where are we now and how did we get here. In tonight's session, we're going to start to look a little bit more at what are we doing about this and where can we go from here. With this underlying theme in both sessions about beginning to imagine new possibilities. So, this was my introductory content from last week. I'll just go through this quickly. This is interactive and participatory. We will have questions at the end. There won't be a break this time. We'll just go straight into questions. And this also is not a discussion on the validity of climate science. That's something that I discussed last week. If you have any questions on why I won't be discussing that, it's probably better we just talk about that afterwards. I accept the science. I also accept science methodology. For that reason, I don't want to engage in a debate about this. And I think the majority of people who come here also do so. But then after this presentation, just to put this in perspective, like what I said at the beginning, I felt like I knew a lot more about sustainability than the average citizen. And now you will also be one of those people. Just by attending one climate change talk, you know more than the average citizen. So you've actually taken on a special role. Moving on. I'm going to do a quick recap of what we went through last week. I know a lot of you are here, so I can probably do it quite quickly, but it might be good to refresh our memories a bit as well. We began by talking about this period of time called the Holocene, which is the last 12,000 years, and it has relatively been climatically stable. And then we looked at how this fits into the normal climate variation in the Earth, and we realized that this is actually very rare and very special. Unfortunately, we then discussed about how we've now left the Holocene, this +1, -1 degree of variation in climate, and we're heading into something called the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is very hard to visualize. We talked about it a lot, and I showed you lots of examples. But one thing that stands out is this phenomenon called the Great Acceleration. So basically, that we're exponentially increasing a number of different things in our society, in our economy, such as energy use, fresh water use, transportation, but anything you think of generally fits into this trend, number of McDonald's restaurants. And this is unfortunately having a lot of exponential growth reactions in our Earth system. So the amount of available fresh water, fertilizer, basically in our water systems, and of course climate change as well. Then we talked about, well, what is a safe operating space for humanity in this new era, the Anthropocene? We talked about how there's a series of planetary boundaries, and not just limited to climate change, but considering a whole lot of other sustainability challenges, beyond which, if we go through this threshold, we risk potentially large risks, but more than anything, a series of unknowns about what the new world will look like as we move into this new world. I'm going through this all quite quickly. If there are any questions, then please do just put up your hand. We also discussed about the way we measure carbon emissions. So focusing more on climate change in this section, we talked about how we often hear about China and India being some of the big polluters. And this is true when we count all of the emissions within a certain area, and we account emissions to entire countries. But when you instead look at emissions based on per capita, so the number of people in a country, but also when you look at consumption emissions, so we have two ways of accounting for emissions. Territorial, meaning the emissions that happen inside a country. Consumption emissions, meaning assigning the emissions of the production process to the end user. That sounds confusing. But for example, this was probably not made in Australia. This created emissions overseas. And at the moment, we're accounting them to China rather than to the people who gain the entire benefit of the production of that good. And then we talked about the ecological deficit that we're running. So we're not allowed to run economic deficits. We hear this all the time. But if basically everyone in the world did like an Australian citizen did, if we had 7 billion Australians in the world, we would need 5 Earths, or more than 5 Earths, to produce the amount of resources that we consume in each and every year. The world in general isn't doing so good, with the average across the world being 1.7 Earths, but obviously Australia is the higher end of this. So, something new. That was a less than 10-minute recap of an hour's worth of content. So if you felt like that went too fast, there was too much information, then feel free to ask me after the presentation for more information about that. Or if you want a copy of my slides as well, then please also shoot me an email. But I just wanted to go through that quickly so we're all more or less on the same page. In my presentations, I often talk a bit fast when I'm talking about science, and then I go and talk very slowly when I'm asking questions and saying, but why? So I hope that you follow my presentation style. Again, put up your hand if you do have any questions. I wanted to start by looking at these thresholds that we discussed last session rather. So we talked about the planetary boundaries and how beyond that we might go into a new way of functioning in the Earth system. But specifically focusing on climate change, there are also a number of particular thresholds. This comes from a paper that came out last year, which is called the Hothouse Earth paper. It was one of the most read scientific articles of the whole year. If you ever want to read a scientific article, I would really recommend that one. It's very interesting. Though it is, of course, not, it's a very well presented article, but it's not like what we often hear in the news. It's a bit more scientific. Anyway, this is the headline feature of that article, basically showing us that at different degree thresholds, certain things might start to happen. So, for example, between 1 to 3 degrees of warming, we look at the potential collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, Arctic summer sea ice, and coral reefs. Now, 1 to 3 degrees is obviously still quite unclear. It's quite a large range. There are a lot of unknowns when it comes to sustainability science. But for example, we're already seeing a lot of the effects of coral reefs, and this is one of the first ones that we expect to go out of all these ones that you see here. This is probably under 2 degrees that we'll see the global loss of coral reefs, because they are very vulnerable to temperature change. And then, of course, at higher temperatures, there are also the loss of potentially other Earth system functions. So, that's a bit heavy. What are we doing about this? This isn't something we talked about so much in the last session, but it's what's going to frame a lot of tonight's discussion. So, of course, we're all individually doing things in the states and regions. We're also doing much about climate change. But when we think about what we're doing, we usually think about the global agreement, which was made in Paris in 2015. Every year, all the nations of the world meet to discuss climate change. And often, not very much is agreed upon or decided. But in 2015, we had a very big, important agreement, which was signed by all members of the UN, I believe, which is referred to as the Paris Agreement. And this basically committed all world leaders to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. That's why I wanted to begin with that previous slide, where we saw why we talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 degrees. Because 2 degrees itself isn't particularly safe. Science is not saying that 2 degrees is a safe outcome. But it's the best that we've got, basically, under the kind of political agreement. Well below sounds like we really want to avoid 2 degrees. Pursue efforts to limit to 1.5. Maybe we'll try, but we might not succeed. And what I'm going to present to you in the following slides is basically some research work that I've been doing with Kevin Anderson, who is the Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre in Manchester, about how we can translate this Paris Agreement into something more comprehensible on a local level. And in doing so, it's important to look at what the Paris Agreement commits us to. This is a commitment made by global leaders. And it also commits us to undertake rapid reductions in accordance with best science and on the basis of equity. And equity is very important, remembering that not all countries have the privileges that we have here in Australia. Other countries still need to industrialize and develop in the context of trying to decarbonize their economies. So, how can we think about this? So the work that I'm doing is basically looking at creating a carbon budget. A carbon budget sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but there's 2 ways that I like to illustrate this point. You can think about it as a life salary. So we all work, we all retire. We often need more money in our retirement because we're no longer working. A carbon budget is like receiving a life salary, but receiving it today. So here's your several $100,000 or several $1 million for life. How are you going to plan your money so that you have enough left when you go into retirement and beyond? A carbon budget is like that. It's saying how much carbon emissions can we emit from now until forever in order to reach this 1.5 or 2 or 3 degree target. So there's a different carbon budget for every temperature degree goal that we have, basically. So that's one analogy of a carbon budget. Another way you can think about it, everyone likes to think about food, so another good one is a carbon pie. So a pie that is shared by the whole world. Of course, we have to cut it up into slices, so everyone gets a slice of the pie. But the total pie is only the size of the total pie. We can't make more pie. If we eat too much of this global carbon pie, we're not going to meet that target, if this makes sense. To illustrate this graphically, a carbon budget is basically the area under an emissions reduction curve. All right, so this might start to look a bit too sciencey. So here we have carbon dioxide emissions, and here we have just a time series. And the amount of carbon that we emit is the area under the emissions curve. So to illustrate, we're currently emitting, say, at this level. If we were to emit very slowly, to reduce our emissions very slowly and then try and make a reduction later, we actually emit a lot more than if we were to take action now. Let my graph do that work for me. If we delay stringent action, we emit additional emissions that we then need to compensate for later. So this is why it's really important to think about a carbon budget. Because when we talk about 10% reduction or 20% reduction, it doesn't tell us about the way we're going to get there. It just tells us about the end goal. And what happens on the way to this end goal also is very, very important. Because if we do delay too much, then to be able to catch up, we'll have to do very high emissions reduction rates, which can be very difficult or perhaps not even possible. So, in the context of Paris, going back to the Paris Agreement now, before we had this global agreement in 2015, business as usual scenarios made it look like we were heading to about 4 to 6 degrees of warming. So this is very high. At Paris, all the countries of the world, besides their agreement globally, they also had to make nationally determined contributions. So national voluntary agreements of how much they want to do. And if you add up all of the pledges made by these countries around the world, we're now looking at 3 to 4 degrees of warming, which is an improvement, but it still isn't something that a lot of scientists would consider safe.
Sorry, Aaron, by what time?
So we usually talk about the end of the century. Yeah, 2100. Unfortunately, a lot of modelling, they say sun sets after 2100. You kind of look at models after that amount of time. Potentially, it could be warmer after that period of time as well. So then, in the framework of a carbon budget, translating the words well below 2 degrees, so that says something about the degree of certainty that you're looking for. The remaining carbon budget from 2017 is 800 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide, so 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide. That sounds like still quite a lot of carbon dioxide, but we emit globally around 50 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So if we did nothing at our current emissions, that would probably be about 16 years when that was right. So to be able to reach this, we need to be at zero carbon by 2050, basically, if we want to, according to this science, which I can explain in greater detail if you have more questions about that. But of course, the equity dimension of Paris means that wealthier nations have to reach a zero carbon society ahead of poorer nations. So, how does this fit in with the euphoria behind Paris? Many people around the world are very happy that this agreement came to be. They were very elated that we were taking some action. How does this add up? Well, according to the work of Kevin Anderson and the project that I'm working in, we've basically demonstrated how it's because policymakers have received a different story. They're mainly based on a kind of modelling called integrated assessment modelling, and they use much bigger carbon dioxide budgets, which look like this. Modelling at around 1,600 gigatons of carbon dioxide and with this level of emissions. So for a likely chance of 2 degrees, from IPCC science, so this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN scientific body, they're suggesting around 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So they don't do this directly, but this is the science that they put out there and then what's been calculated. But the IPCC economic modelers are typically using twice that amount. So this is probably all sounding very confusing. How does this make sense? All right, I'll pause for reflection whilst I drink some water. Well, this is because these models use something called negative emissions technologies, which are supposedly going to suck billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's why their curves look like this. Because starting in around 2030, they assume a mass deployment of this technology continuing on to the end of the century, but they also count on carbon dioxide emissions through fossil fuels beyond 2100 in this modeling. So negative emissions technologies. You're probably wondering, what does that mean, Harry? Allow me to explain. But first, I need to take a little diversion to explain something else. So now again, if this is going too quickly, please just put up your hand. I want to make sure that people are following this. You may have heard of something called the carbon cycle before. The carbon cycle is just the way that carbon moves through the Earth's system. So it can be dissolved in the ocean, absorbed by trees, it can be in the atmosphere. It's moving around and it's changing its state. So to grossly oversimplify this, trees absorb carbon by breathing in carbon dioxide, like we breathe in oxygen, they breathe in carbon dioxide. They then grow and lock up that carbon into mass. But then when trees die, either by rotting or when they might be burned down, they burn and they release this carbon back into the atmosphere. So this is a cycle. This has gone on for many millions of years. Very slowly over time, they might build up extra sediment. There might be some logs lying on the ground. You can visualize it that way. And through layer upon layer of soil going on top, this gets all compressed. Plant and animal material gets hyper-compressed. And that's basically how oil is formed. So oil is basically just old trees and old animal products condensed into a liquid form over millions of years. So because this takes millions of years, this process, we just say that it's going around in a circle. It's not going down here to forming oil because it happens too slowly. So this is the one form of thinking about carbon. And then we have also fossil carbon. So this is that oil or other fossil fuels that's underground and then it's being burnt and pushed up into the atmosphere. So these are two fundamentally different carbon cycles. This one's not so much of a cycle, it's more of a one-way movement. So taking one last quick diversion, this also makes it quite interesting to think about carbon offsetting. And I won't talk about this in too much detail, but because this is something we've all heard of, I thought I would touch on this quickly. Because we can offset a number of different things in a number of different ways. So I'm not going to make any generalization. But often what we do is if we emit carbon dioxide, we plant a tree. And the problem with this is that these are different carbon cycles. That tree was already part of that cycle. And by planting a new tree, it can't really compensate for the emissions that have happened here. The only way to compensate for that is to somehow get this back down there. So, negative emissions technology. You may have heard of something called bioenergy before. So bioenergy is basically recognizing this carbon cycle with trees and putting a combustion in the middle there for us to gain energy. So grow some trees or some crops, burn them, and that goes back into the energy, back into the atmosphere. So it's keeping carbon within the cycle. So burning wood, of course, is not very efficient. Burning wood emits more carbon dioxide than burning coal. But the difference here is that it's never left the cycle. So it's considered carbon neutral in that sense. The main form of negative emissions technology is something called bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So you can now see why I've walked you slowly up until this point. Because if I just drop this slide in without any context, this would have been probably too much to take in. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is basically recognizing this first process, but then instead of burning this wood, it's captured and put underground into geological storage. So that's why it's considered a negative emissions technology. It's getting carbon from this first cycle, that's the circular one, but then putting it underground, so storing it away. And this is what's assumed in these models. So I know this is quite technical, what we're talking about now, but this is the modeling that's done for the UN body, basically, on climate change. There's a few problems with this, though. Firstly, it's not very efficient. We need a lot of trees. The estimates that I read recently were somewhere between the whole size of India to something more than our current agricultural land space to be able to fit with that model's prediction of how much they want to suck up. It's a huge amount of space. But the other problem is that this hasn't been tested at scale. We don't know very much about this technology. We don't know if when we put the carbon down there, it's going to stay down there. So we can liquefy it and put it into aquifers. We can put it into depleted oil reserves, but we just don't know if it's going to stay down there, which is a bit problematic when the model is based entirely on this working. Even if some of these fail, we're going to be putting that carbon into the air and achieving nothing. But it's quite possible that more than some of these will just fail. So again, we were talking about negative emissions technologies. There are many different kinds, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I wanted to present you this one because it is the one that is the most researched and considered most likely to be able to deliver upon what these models suggest. So this is the headline negative emissions technology. So that's not sounding so good. The problem is that the Paris Agreement commits us to operating under best science. And I'll leave this up to you whether you think that this is a fair assumption for us to be implementing and for policymakers to be accepting, which they currently are. Because it's easy. It's easy when you have these easy mitigation rates. It's easy to sell this. We often talk a lot about technology, and I'm going to now go into a bit of a talk about technology, because we think that technology will be the one that saves us. And what I think is really interesting with technology is that we often have a linear projection of our current technology and assume that things will just develop more in that direction. And I think that's why some of you are having a bit of a laugh at this. This was obviously a view in I guess the 50s or the 60s. Okay, so waterproofing must have been getting some ground there, but it didn't take off quite in the way that we thought, or the way that they thought that it would. But what else stands out about this image? Is there anything else that seems a bit strange?
They thought that stupid housewives.
Yes. So they didn't get the technology just wrong. They overlooked the fact that, okay, maybe women will become more emancipated, maybe women will go into the workforce. So we often, with technology, just look in a linear direction and think it's going to keep going that way, and don't think at all about social change. Where social change, if you think about the last 100 years, has been really quite dramatic. And it's also a big source of potential as well. I know that this is sounding quite depressing, what I'm saying right now. But I think this image also has an optimistic message that we need to think about. But then, considering that the assumptions behind these reports were based on this technology that might have sounded better as a plan B or a plan C rather than as a plan A, I thought I'd just quickly go into what the plan B is on the discussion of technology. Now, these are just lots of reports, you don't need to read them, but they're all basically about the same thing. It's my way of indicating that there's been a lot of discussion and debate about this. So this isn't something that's happening on the periphery. This is something that is called solar radiation management. So failing our ability to reduce our emissions, failing our ability to suck emissions out of the air, our next plan is, if we can't change our behavior to fit the climate, we change our climate to fit the behavior, our behavior. So this is called geoengineering, basically engineering a new kind of climate. And again, there's many different ways that you can do this. Some of them include putting iron filings into the ocean so that the ocean becomes more fertilized and sucks more carbon. There's lots of funky ideas. This is the main one, it's the one that's most discussed, so again, that's the one I wanted to draw your attention to tonight. So this basically recognizes the principle that when you have a big volcanic eruption, we've noticed that it gets cooler. We've seen this through history many, many times. By injecting sulfur into the upper atmosphere, volcanoes generally, well, if they're big enough eruptions, they can force something called a volcanic winter, which just means that everything gets cooler by a degree or two, but only for a couple of years, then things go back to normal. So in the wake of this, we thought, well, perhaps this is something that we can do artificially. And it looks more or less like this, which is you'd have some giant sea container or cargo ship out at sea, where things won't hit this apparatus, and you have a giant, you can see a hollow tube connected to a helium balloon. From the top of the helium balloon, you can inject sulfur into the upper atmosphere in the way that volcanoes do. So this is something that's becoming more and more discussed among scientists, but the more I talk about this to normal people who aren't working with this all the time, they often question that this seems a little bit strange doing this. So in our questions, we can talk about this, and I'd like to hear more about what you think about this. But this is something that is being discussed. And whilst we don't know much about putting carbon into storage and keeping it underground, we seem to be pretty good at emitting things. So I think that this technology probably is more likely to succeed based on that very simple assumption. So the other last thing I wanted to say, just to get technology out of the way, is that another argument is we'll just make things more efficient. We make things more efficient, we'll be emitting less, we'll be causing less damage. The problem is when we make things more efficient, there's usually a rebound effect, which usually means we consume them more. So I have two diagrams here. This one's the easier to follow diagram. This is the nerdier one if you want to look at that instead. But basically it's the same principle, that when something becomes more efficient, it becomes cheaper. When something becomes cheaper, we use more of it. When we use more of it, it undoes the benefits that we get from it being more efficient. So here, this is just recognizing the difference in price and the difference in consumption. But you can also just look at this diagram here. So where do we go from here? This is the next part of my presentation. Do we adapt or transform? I like this quote from Einstein, actually, which is that you can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking you used when you created them. We need a new way of thinking. That's a bit hard to theorize. And it's hard to know what might be the right way of thinking. But we talked perhaps a little bit in the last section about thinking in systems. So a system isn't a computer system or a program. A system meaning an economy, or it could mean a society, a social system, or a social ecological system. Thinking in systems just basically means when you make an effect here, what's going to happen here and here, and just looking at it as an entire system, if this makes sense. It doesn't need to make too much sense though, because the analogy is easy because it's based on an iceberg. So a guide for thinking in systems and where we can make changes in a system is quite simply put like this. On the superficial level, we often think about, well, what's just happened, and we can react to that. This is the most superficial way of thinking. So you might think about, there's some flooding going on, suddenly everything is flooded, what do? We need to bring in the army to help out the victims, we need to X, Y, Z. But if we go deeper, remembering that an iceberg has most of its mass under the water, if we start to think a bit deeper and less superficially, we can start to anticipate potential things. So of course, if we expect climate changes, what kinds of areas might be affected by flooding, and how can we give them the capacity that they need to be able to do something about that? If we go deeper, you can probably guess how much more is coming. There's a little bit more. If we go deeper, we can think about what are the patterns behind this, and we can start to think about how we can design things better so that we don't just need to anticipate and react. We can prevent them even earlier. So when we think down here lower, we see that it kind of helps us with these higher forms as well, often through preventing those problems. But when we think here, we don't get the same flow down effects. Right at the bottom, we have transforming. So here we think about the values and the assumptions behind that system and what is keeping it in place. So when you think about where in the system you want to intervene, there are, of course, shallow ways to intervene, and they're very important in certain circumstances. But we need to think about at all levels how we can think about things differently. How can we react better, anticipate better, but also design and transform. So I wanted to then go a little bit into this idea of transforming, because this is what I've also been doing quite a bit of research on. When we transform something, it's usually a reorganization of the current ways of doing it. This is often linked to technology, because technology means we can do new things in new ways. Like I can point like this instead of like this. But it could also be a social institution. So the UN didn't exist before World War II, well, not in the form that it did. And that allowed us to organize global governance. So they're often linked to some kind of innovation. Here I've kind of gone for a technical kind of a thing. But I wanted to ask you, this is basically a temporary pop-up shelter for homeless people that was designed and implemented in Los Angeles. Do we think that this is a kind of transformation? I'm very curious, this isn't that much of a loaded question. I would like to hear from you guys.
It's just going to encourage more homeless if they're going to have to live. I'm not asking the question, why are they homeless?
Okay, that's a very good response. Would anyone like to add anything more?
It's an adaptation that's all it takes. Bring something back to one of these guys or one of these people who end up on this treadmill.
Very good responses.
It's using the concept of a house or a tent as we think it now. It's not new thinking. There's one person living in something that gives him or her shelter, but it's somehow constrained still in what we think of as being living in a house.
Yes.
Same basic thinking.
Yeah.
It's transaction, not transformation.
Quite a number of interesting. Yeah.
It's symptom therapy.
Symptom therapy.
Let's plan that.
Okay, these are some really good responses. I don't need to go to my prompting questions, which is what I was going to have here. But these are probably also worth engaging with. Does it question underlying values, beliefs, or assumptions? Well, I think we've maybe answered that. If it's not a transformation, we already had a few good answers about what it could be, but what would a transformation look like in this same field if we wanted to do something on homelessness? What would be a transformation?
Spend a lot more money on public housing.
Public housing, yep.
Change the economic system.
Change the economic system.
Universal basic income.
Yeah. So, but these are now fundamentally different ways of thinking, aren't they? So that's what distinguishes the transformation from other innovations. The question then is, does this make it easier or harder or have no effect on a transformation in the same field by creating these temporary pop-up shelters? Hmm?
Based on what problems go away.
It makes it look like what's that?
Problems go away.
It may cause some help in the short term, but I think it would make it harder in the long term for the
Okay.
We were in Hawaii recently, and there was a noticeable homeless population there in Paradise, and talking to locals, that was because a lot of US states, to get rid of the homeless population, to get Hawaii. But yeah, they can actually do somewhere that's not as cold as challenging. They go up the streets of Hawaii as soon as favour export.
That's a very interesting response, that one there. So I like to ask a lot of questions. I don't give a lot of answers. I think these are very interesting answers. But this is how we co-create knowledge in an interactive learning space. I think they're good answers. I can't say what's right, what's wrong. We all have different opinions. So what is this? I think we've come up with lots of good terms for what this potentially is. So we don't need to answer that. So adaptation, that's what I was kind of hinting at what this might be. So an adaptation basically means that we continue on our current pathway as it is. So we just fix things here and there to make the current pathway even more stronger. I guess we're saying it might be harder to then have a real transformation because what we're doing is we're paving an even stronger pathway.
And we've created a rhetoric that the powers that be can then quote, we see all this evasion all the time in the media when politicians ask, what are you doing about this? Or why aren't you doing this? And instead of answering that question, they'll say what they've done. We've put all these cardboard shelters out, draw attention to what we've done, to deflect attention from the fact that the problem is still there and it still requires fundamental change to really solve it.
Very good point. Whereas the transformation is about changing the system. Now, often this isn't saying, oh, revolution or anything like that. It's saying doing things in a new and a different way. It's not saying stopping people from doing things the way that they currently are. It's about building a new system, whilst perhaps to some extent breaking down the old system. But a truly powerful transformation would be saying that that's just a natural consequence of doing so. When we make a new pathway, and we make a really good pathway, people are going to want to walk down that pathway. And we don't even need to think about destroying the old pathway. So this isn't to be confused with revolution, taking up arms. This is just about doing things in a better way and getting more people to support it. So how do we transform? I don't think I'll talk too much to these slides. We looked at these slides a little bit last session when we talked about how systems, social, ecological systems, or whatever they may be, often can exist in two different kinds of states. So maybe here or maybe here. This is a coral-dominated reef. This is an algae-dominated reef. All coral reefs can be coral-dominated or algae-dominated. Depends on the circumstances. Once you start having one system, it locks itself in. So you've got a coral reef here. There might be some big storms. They might shake this around. It's going to roll back down into this same little cup here. So think of gravity pulling these down. So I often say, well, you can sometimes change the Prime Minister, change the tax here or there, but that's just going to push it around a little bit. It'll roll back down. Same way in social systems or social ecological systems. To then get over here, well, how do we get over here? You can have a huge shock to the system, which is send this flying over here. But a more gradual and safe way is also to just gradually erode this here, make it flatter, and then it'll just roll down to here. So by that, I mean, that I'm framing this in a positive way. I'm saying by changing values or changing things little by little, we can start to create a new pathway, and it might take us to a new system, which itself is stable. Because when we first have these innovations, when we first have these startup projects, they can easily fall apart. They need to reach maturity. But when they do, they might have the capacity to create a new way of doing things. And then they will have their own feedbacks which lock them in place. Anyway, if you didn't understand that, it's not too important. Let's focus on the good discussion we had on the slide before. But this sounds too hard. Well, we've actually done this before. A lot of big social changes, when we feel like there's a need. I quite like this example. I get a lot of pictures from the 50s and 60s. It's a very recent period of time, but very different in a lot of ways. Sorry, from the 40s, obviously, yeah. So we obviously know, I think that the US is a lot more libertarian than we are. They're a lot more about personal freedoms. They don't like the government on their back. In the state of New Hampshire, every number plate says live free or die. And also, it's not even compulsory to wear a seatbelt when you drive your car because that's considered an unfair imposition of the government. The government can't tell me to put a seatbelt on. All right? So just to put that in context, in the 1940s, they had these ads going around the US saying that basically, if you don't carpool, then you're supporting the Nazis. And even with this scary picture of Ghost Hitler next to you in your car, so that when you're in your car next time on your own, you'll have that scary feeling of who's in the seat next to you. We have done this before. We also had so much self-sustainability and self-sufficiency during the war period because all the food that could be produced had to be sent to the front line. So we had victory gardens. There was a whole new reframing of the way that people conducted their own self-sustainability. It was called a victory garden. And you can see there's a bunch of nice little pictures there about people doing their bit for the country just by growing their own and eating their own carrots. So we have done this before. In terms of what we need to transform, this is another open question that I'd like to reflect upon with you guys, maybe in the question time. One thing that I think about might need transforming is just our view on the environment more generally. This looks pretty good. Save our environment. Who agrees that we should save the environment? I mean, why would you not? Everyone likes the environment, we should save the environment. And I can see some of you are starting to look at me a bit strange, like maybe I put you in a trap here. When we think about saving the environment, we think about the environment being something over there. I can go over there and I can save it. I can plant some trees over there and I can pick up some rubbish over there and I'm saving the environment. But we wouldn't say the same thing about saving our brains. Our brain is something that's just a part of us. So you can't really save your brain. If you don't have a brain, you don't have much else. And a brain isn't something that you have in the fridge that you can put a bit of food and water in and look after daily. It's an embedded part of our system. In the same way, nature's an embedded part of our system. We have the air conditioning on right now because it is hot, for example. We are constantly in nature, and most of the goods that we have on it, or all the goods that we have on and around us, are from some natural resource that was produced under some climatic conditions somewhere in the world. So nature is something that is around us, and when we say save the environment, we're often saying that it's over there and that it's a peripheral goal. Because if the environment's over there, it doesn't matter too much whether or not we save it or not, because it's not that fundamental. This is a conventional way of looking at nature, society, and the economy. But I often think that we think more about nature, and I wasn't going to make my own image, I apologize for that. I often think that we may think of nature as maybe being half in the economy, but also half not, because it's really far away sometimes. So it's definitely not in society or in the economy. It's not doing anything useful over there, even if it's sucking up carbon dioxide. So when it's this far away from our understanding of ourselves and our society, we think that we probably should and could do something about it, but if we don't, then it's maybe not such a big deal either because it's very far away where these consequences are happening. A new way of looking at nature, society, and the economy is something called ecological economics, which basically says that the economy is embedded in a society, which itself is embedded in the biosphere. So, of course, in the economy, we have workers and they're producing goods, but they also go to work hungry. They need to eat breakfast before they head out into the workforce. So we need to have a healthy society. And also work stress also flows out of the economy into society when people get overworked and become overstressed. But again, that food also comes from somewhere. That's making our society healthy. It comes from nature. And also that stress that we experience in society also can go back into nature through frustration, through people thinking, don't litter, I'm going to litter anyway. So people, that was a very strange example, I admit, but there are many examples. When we think about things differently, when we think about these being embedded, what we realize is that saving nature, if we're thinking of it that way, it should be a natural consequence of just our ways of being and our ways of conducting business, because we know that if we cause damage to the biosphere, it's going to come back to us in some particular way. Interestingly, we often think also that nature is fragile. When we say protect nature or save the environment, it's as if it's a small child that needs looking after. And we think about the economy as being something strong. We're talking about the economy will trend to equilibrium and all of this kind of rhetoric. The thing is, when we think about it this way, we also see that there's a whole part of nature that just doesn't exist in the society or the environment, and probably doesn't care so much about what happens to society and to the environment. If we are going through another mass extinction in this next epoch of our lives, of our history as a race, it could well be that some new species have to adapt and others survive and others don't. But what's happened every time we've had a mass extinction is that new animals have just evolved. So nature is strong. We characterize it as something being weak, but nature is actually much stronger than we are. And the economy, if we think about what happened in 2008, when just a housing bubble, just a bunch of speculators could bring a huge dip in all economic productivity. It's the only time emissions have really gone down in the last 20 years, because we just have so much less economic activity. The economy suddenly seems weak and perhaps not as strong as something like the economy. So it's what we need transforming to some extent is also our ways of thinking, not just our ways of acting, but the way we characterize. We talked last week about how we have this kind of vision of growth in society. And maybe this is good when it comes to well-being, but we attach this kind of thinking to just economic activity. We have economies that grow whether or not they improve our well-being. What we need is we need economies that improve our well-being whether or not they grow. And remembering that nature also grows, but it does reach maturity. It reaches a point where it's good, it's sufficient. So there is some scope for thinking differently as well in terms of the way that our economy will operate. But we talked about this last week, so I won't go too much more into that. But then you're asking me, yeah, okay, this is slightly starting to convince me, but is anything really changing, Aaron? And then I have a bunch of examples. Because if we think about 2007, 2008 again, we saw how much governments were able to mobilize huge amounts of funds when there was a perceived crisis to prevent the economy from falling apart during the GFC. But we also look at how the media flows and information flows are becoming much more empowering for small users who can, through social media, have more of an impact. We look at Sanders and Corbyn as radical positions that are breaking through without support of the establishment on the political scene globally. But then we also see Brexit and Trump as a new anti-establishment bloc acting on the global stage. All right, and you can see more here, the Arab Spring, in terms of people power, the plummeting price of renewables, but also lots of other impacts related to fossil fuels that aren't good for society are becoming more discussed. Yes?
Yeah, can I add the Me Too movement?
Yeah.
Well, we talk about social change, so that's something else that's sort of happening in the context of what you're saying.
For sure. And I think the Me Too is also linked into the tools that were given to these people. It might not have been able to occur if it weren't for social media empowering small actors to be able to make a stand. So things are changing. And what do you think has potential hurdles here to change? I usually like to actually have a big discussion with each of these long questions, but I think we'll put that just to the question time, because otherwise we might go a bit over. We think a lot about our ecological footprints and how we can minimize the damage that we do. And of course, this is worth thinking about, and it's very important. And there are lots of different ways to measure this and look at this. They're very context dependent, of course, because each country uses different kinds of power. These kinds of indicators, I think, are useful because they give you some indication, but of course, we often don't know. We just don't know how much emissions are through our daily activity. But I mean, some interesting, I don't like to talk too much to these graphs, but some interesting points are, unfortunately, having less children is considered one of the biggest things that you can do. And if you look at how the scale sticks here from 4 up to many digits of based on 10 men, it is a big impact. But also, I talked a lot about flying and how this one here comes in at number 3 is just one transatlantic flight. But I don't like to focus too much on this because we shouldn't just think about doing less damage. And we talk a lot about ecological footprints, but something that I don't know if I've read this elsewhere, or I probably have, but I've been thinking more about what kind of ecological handprint we want to have. Because we can also build with our hands. We can also create something here. And in terms of what we can do in terms of that, I think that that's something that we can all think about. I was doing a talk on the weekend up in Perth, and they were asking me in the context of the election, what can we do? How can we make the most out of this? We often think that we can vote for a party that's exercising our democratic right, and it's something that can impact the system. But in the context of an upcoming election, and in the context of an ecological handprint, I also said, but I think there's much more. In the context of an election, it's when political parties are coming out and basically trying to win our votes. And it's the time that they're making all of these pledges as well. So yes, we can wait till voting day, but we can also impact political parties by saying what we want, by writing to our local members and saying we want something here. Because now is a good time to go shopping around and to get pledges from all of these different people who might be representing us. So that was one reflection I just had recently on the context of the election, but of course, there's many things that we can do. We can all have an ecological handprint in a way that we have an ecological footprint. So, this is a choice at the end of the day. Because if you agree with what I've been saying to you, and if you agree with the science behind it, then things are going to change over the next 100 years, perhaps quite large things. And we have an option. We have two options, basically. By not doing anything, we're just guaranteeing that it will be the climate that decides what changes we'll see, under what circumstances, where and when. But we can also make a choice and say that we recognize that big changes will happen, but let's decide under what conditions they happen, where and when, by empowering ourselves, by limiting the effects of potential climate changes. So this is a fundamental choice that we do have. We can't not choose to act on climate change. We can only choose to not act, if that makes sense. We can't not choose to act because not acting is a choice. We know enough about the science, especially in Western countries. We know enough about what's going on, at least our policymakers do. And by not acting, we're also making an active choice. So, that's not sounding too positive. And unfortunately, there's one last dip before we come back up again, which is just that winning slowly is basically the same as losing outright. There are victories that we are having, and we can see more and more of them. But if this happens too slowly, it doesn't really seem like much of a victory. Because in the face of both triumphant denialism, so that's what we often see in a lot of climate deniers here in Australia and in the US, and predatory delay, which is more what we see in places like Europe, we don't deny the science. Trying to achieve climate action by doing the same things the same old ways means defeat. It guarantees defeat. This is a quote by Alex Stephen. But then, like I said last week, to end on something more positive, at every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. Think about those images that I showed from the 40s and the 50s. This is the society of only one or two generations up, or perhaps some of you also lived through that period. And how different that society was to our one today. We can reimagine our society, and we can rebuild our society by believing in that imagination and making it real. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Aaron. That was an excellent presentation. So that is the end of the presentation tonight, but we are going to go into the discussion. So if anyone did need to head off now, you can. And we'll have probably about 10, 15 minutes of discussion, question and answers with Aaron. So I'll leave you to that one, Aaron. Thank you.
Sure.
Yep.
And like I say, like keep the conversation going. If you do need to run off, I've got my email. I'm very curious to hear more of your thoughts. But let's make the most of this time and open it up to discussions, questions, and comments.
Aaron, the last week was a paper concerning cloud formation and climate change. Are you aware of climate change?
No, I'm not.
Okay. It was written about cloud formation, stratocumulus, and the fact that after a certain amount of temperature change, that structural clouds would actually disappear. They wouldn't be formed anymore, and that those clouds would lead to an 8-degree increase in temperature. This is the modelling that's been done in the US. And then, in order to reverse that, it wasn't simply a matter of dropping those 8 degrees, you'd actually have to drop considerably more
To reverse that effect.
To reverse the
Yeah.
effect, yes.
Yeah, that's what we talked a bit about in the last session, I'm not sure. How the pathway to get somewhere is not the same as the pathway back. So once we melt the polar ice caps, they're not going to refreeze at the same temperature at which they melted. They need to go much lower. I haven't heard about this paper. 8 degrees sounds quite drastic, but it sounds like it makes logical sense that this could be a feedback. I think often we can't quantify exactly what the effect of each of these feedbacks will be. Because in some parts, I don't know if this applies globally, my guess is that it would probably be more, this could happen regionally under certain conditions. And then in other places, we might have opposite effects. But it is very true that there are a lot of unknowns. It is very true that there are a lot of feedbacks. So if things go down a particular path, they might continue to go faster. So that's why I always preach the precautionary principle, rather than conducting a global level experiment with potential consequences. It's interesting.
Was that if things got to this level, that these clouds didn't form, well, that affects about 20 or 30% of the clouds around the world.
Okay. And then that would, yeah.
The reflective ability of those clouds is then gone. They're not reflecting like 30% of the energy back in space. And that's what the heat the oceans and drive us off.
Yeah. Or if you could send me that paper, I'd be very curious to read it. One of these geoengineering things that I was talking about is also to create artificial clouds, recognizing this problem, or this effect that clouds have. People also think that we could do cloud seeding, basically. I don't know how that would affect solar generation and other problems, but who knows? It is something that is discussed. But there are lots of feedbacks. Another really big one people talk about is the permafrost in Russia. Russia seems to like climate change, but they're taking no action on it. Russia's looking forward to a big thaw because it will boost their agriculture. It will boost their ability to get Arctic oil. There are matrices done about which countries gain under climate change, and Russia is predicted to be one of those that can gain financially, unfortunately. But also in Russia, there's a lot of methane that is under permanently frozen land. And if that, I guess mud, if that defrosts, it could let out huge amounts of methane very instantaneously. And this is one of these really big feedbacks. We don't know when that would happen, hopefully at a very high temperature, but it's a similar kind of principle. Yes?
Yeah, that's the same thing with the Antarctic. The country, I think 2030 is the Antarctic Treaty ends, and that's when the nations will be bidding for some oil and gas reserves. And yeah, methane is one of the topics that will come out of that. But just to go back on the Q&A, hurdles in the way.
Yeah.
I like to thank all the senior people here that have input here. It's brilliant. I thought that there'd be more younger people here because, after all, they'll be the ones affected. So, credit to all the elderly of Mandarin who come along and go to events like this. It's awesome to see. I have been, 1988. I was 25 and I went to the Greenhouse 88 conference, which was a national conference held by the government at that time, and I attended the conference in Darwin, and it was all satellite linked. So, 30 years on. So, in the question, hurdles in the way. Well, we have governments and their agendas that are in the way. We have a very popular federal representative in this town, but he is sidelined by other people in the federal government that still don't believe too much in climate change. So I don't know if that candidate is really on board in action for real climate change. But yeah, it would be interesting to see. So I know he's very popular in this place, but yeah, people to ask the question to him if they're friends of him. So he's got a lot of friends in this place.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, now's a great time to ask all politicians, because even if they get lost in their work, the rest of their mandate period, this is the time when they're all looking to hear from the potential voters, and all of you here are voters. Maybe most of you in Canning, I'm not sure, but in all the electorates around here. Yeah.
But the problem is they can go out on the platform, but then as soon as they get in, they can immediately change them.
Yeah.
So there's no, that's, yeah. And And that's not just environmentally, that's across a lot of other areas as well.
Yeah. Well, then we also need to remind the youth community this. Of course, they don't have to do anything once they're in power, but in a democracy, there are certain expectations that they should fulfill at least some certain quotas. I think that we've seen the effects recently with the federal government now starting to talk about climate change. I don't like to talk too much about politics. I'm just talking from science, but we have seen basically how there was a discussion about other issues, namely immigration, and then the government began to realize that maybe we should start talking about the climate. So it's a great time to engage with that. Did you want to follow up?
I was just going to say that one of the problems that seems to occur in Australia is apart from that, it's all different states. Everybody seems to have different rules. You know, even look at these container recycling, whatever in South Australia, they don't have that for air. Why now that they're going to bring it in, are they going to leave it for another year or whatever? It's a problem.
Yeah, but as much as it's a barrier, it's also an opportunity because it's very hard to create national level change. But WA only has 2 million people. It's a much more workable size if you think about it. And the way I see change occurring, it always has to be a combination of top down and bottom up. And so these are all different leverage points. Good or bad, they're all different tools that we have and we can use them all for good or bad. Did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to disclose that I'm a Greens candidate and I don't want to know where the size is big. I don't want to, but you can contact the Greens and you can speak with the senators. Sorry, Aaron.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I think you were next. Yes.
I thought, well, I think that it starts with money. The bottom line, controlling the thought process is cash. And I saw a good ray of hope or light in that Australian bank ad on SBS on the psychology of human beings. When a bank who controls cash actually puts out a clever ad, a thought-provoking ad, into changing people's ways of thinking about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't seen the ad.
Very clever.
But it makes sense because I think banks are realizing that more people are choosing banks that don't invest in fossil fuels.
It's promoting change of thought with the psychology in human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's really
Exactly.
important.
I mean, business also reacts a lot to our values, obviously, because they try and sell us products that fit in with our values. An interesting point just on banks also is that what people don't recognize a lot of the time with the money, what happens with the money we put in the bank account, obviously doesn't just stay there locked in a vault anymore, it's invested. But more than that, it's not just your money that is invested because you only need a small reserve of cash to be able to make a large investment. Unless if everyone goes to the bank and withdraws their money tomorrow, the banks will collapse because there is never enough money in banks. In terms of your investment power, this means that for every dollar you put in the bank will loan out $10. They only keep a 10% reserve rate. So if you have $10,000 in a bank, that could be a $100,000 bank. And then we start to talk about big numbers if we're talking about investments in fossil infrastructure or non-fossil infrastructure. But yes, getting a bit off topic there, but I also find a lot of this economic stuff very interesting. Yes?
As I thought before, the low problem is really original and that the planet's old enough for several intelligent species to evolve and we're dealing with somebody else's solutions here. Was there once a two-legged dinosaur that went into his boss's office and said, I've got a brilliant geotechnical way of getting rid of all this carbon problems we've got, boss. We're going to put them all underground. We're going to call them gas for them.
I'll take that one as a comment. Yes.
How important is the building of soil carbon to provide a short-term solution?
The building of what, sorry?
The building of soil carbon in agricultural soils.
Okay, I don't know too much about agriculture, but I know that agricultural emissions are something that unfortunately will never be able to reduce to zero. So even when we till the soil, we often talk about plant-based diets versus non-plant-based diets, but even just tilling the soil means that we emit carbon dioxide. So this is why we need a lot of reforestation programs. We need a lot of offsetting to offset agriculture, because agriculture will never be zero carbon. So I don't know about that particular way that we could intervene in the agricultural system, but I do know that we probably need to do agriculture in new and innovative ways, because our current efficiency maximizing way of looking at agriculture is producing a lot of carbon emissions. So things like permaculture try to reduce carbon emissions, though they are less efficient. So this is the problem. How do we feed so many people in a greener way? Did you have a question? Oh,
Yes.
oh sorry, I wasn't sure.
Sorry. Why is it we don't really look at the only system we really know that works is the natural system? And why don't we move more towards that? Is it something in our psychology, whether it's reflexive thinking rather than reflective thinking? I mean, you put up a slide about kids, right? It's being having a huge impact, but that would take reflective thinking to kind of bring that down, and then you kind of become more in balance with what nature is if there's less people, say. And then we always look at it like technology. We're moving forward. We're going to have a solve now. We're going to have a solve after that. So why don't we just say where we want to be is where our species as human beings is in nature?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I don't think I have an answer to that question. I think it's something that we can all reflect on. I mean, we know that Indigenous Australians have lived very sustainably in incredibly harsh climate for 60, 80,000 years potentially. Connecting to nature is a great way of ensuring that if nature fluctuates, you're going to be able to move with it rather than building these houses right by the sea, just saying everything's going to be fine for X amount of time. It's something we've put ourselves in this vulnerable position. And I talked about it with the Anthropocene and the Holocene. Before we had this warm, stable period, we were hunters and gatherers, not by choice, but by need, because we couldn't rely on agriculture and living in the same place, producing the same outcome. We had to move, we had to follow suit. That's a very good point. If anyone wants to respond to that as well, please also do. I don't have a monopoly on that by any means. Yes?
So I'm just thinking, like, you know, you were talking about, you know, a new pathway, new ways of thinking, right? And just as an average person, I was thinking, I actually have no idea how to begin like a new pathway. I'm emailing politicians, trying to come to these events. I'm not very, like, you know, clever enough to come up with these creative ideas. What can we do to make greater change, if that makes sense?
That's a really good question.
That's like, and I kind of feel it. So I'm just wondering, like, how do I support the science? How do I support initiatives that actually make these changes or get things started that direction? Have you got any suggestions?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think about this personally a lot as well, because I don't think it's the expectation on you or on me to come up with a solution that solves everything. I think that it's far beyond all of us. I don't think that I have any great solutions to all of these things, but there's usually someone out there who does. And if you find someone who's doing something good, you can help them, you can support them, you can help build their thing. Not everyone's able to come up with great ideas. I haven't had any recently, unfortunately. But if you see something and you see potential in it, then give those people a helping hand, because often these people who start new ways of doing things are overworked. They're fighting against potential barriers all the time. Can do with all the support that I have. But it's a very good question. I wish I could have clearer answers. It's more specific thing.
I think we forget to how to use our imagination, and I think, like, sorry, I didn't see the last question. Like coming together like this and talking about things, and you know, interacting with the community. Like three brains better than one. Like it's amazing where conversations and imagination can take you, and two or more people come together and start talking about these things. And I think we really just need to exercise new ways of thinking about things and not rejecting them. We've got no ideas.
Yeah, just networking, like, you know, you being here is a positive, you know. And
Yeah.
networking with people similar than us.
If anyone does have any good ideas, you've got someone who's willing to help you along there. So have a chat after the talk. Yeah.
Aaron, you talked a little bit about geoengineering. Isn't that sort of relying on technologies that are quite intuitive, like crossing our fingers? I think that science will say, and some science will talk about.
Yeah.
Down the track. So
I think that I think it's fine that we investigate this, that we research this. It's good to have lots of options. I'm not saying technology is bad. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look into the different options we have. But my problem, as I showed you, is that our models for just reaching any kind of safe temperature limit are currently based on skeptical technologies because they haven't been tested at scale. It's okay to have a plan B, C, D, E, but we should actually have a really good plan A. Because if we make our plan B our plan A, the other issue with this is that you can see the deployment of these is from 2030 onwards, with large scaling out by 2050. So who are the people making these decisions in these models? They're probably people that are very senior with a lot of experience. They're probably going to go into retirement in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So what they're doing is basically saying, I've done my bit. Next generation, my own children, you solve this one. I've told you what you need to do. Go and do it. And that's a huge moral hazard. It's easy for you to retire in that context, thinking that someone else is going to solve the problem. So that's my main problem with it. We should have a plan A that we can fulfill ourselves and that we can achieve, rather than just passing it on to the next generation to figure out how to invent what we need.
I think the other thing about that plan, plan A, that should actually be plan B. The other influence going on in there is that the people with best interests in continuing to do things the way we do them now, to get so that they can get wealthy. That's their best interest, is getting wealthy. That's giving them more time to continue on their current trajectory and get a bit more wealthy in the meantime, shore themselves up before the real action has to happen in 20 or 30 years' time or 10 years' time.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair and reasonable thing to say. I didn't want to come at you and say that, but yeah, I think that that's a very good point. Yes.
So can I also make a comment? It's just a comment. It's about carbon capture and storage. That technology you're talking about is technology which you're probably aware is already used by the oil and gas industry to extract oil and gas. So they already inject, usually as some kind of chemical, but it's mostly compressed carbon dioxide to push out hard to reach oil and gas. So much so that there's an indirect the offshore greenhouse gas storage act, controlling the greenhouse gas storage act. Because for a time when the emissions trading scam, oil companies, gas companies that were using that technology were also able, or at least potentially able to get carbon offsets to trade. So they could make money doing something they already did as an offset to offset the carbon emissions. So the whole, and that is one reason why emissions trading scam. Yeah, so and that is I personally think that was the reason why carbon capture and storage is being pushed, and I don't know if you know, I'm sure you do. That is part of the reason why the oil and gas project was approved, because whoever it is who's running that project said, we will try our best to inject the carbon emissions into the oil and gas, into the substrata, and they haven't managed to do it. But they said they were trying to do it to make the project much less carbon intensive.
I think that's very interesting.
Don't think that it's a great solution. It's just new technology. It's just repurposed technology, and it is quite inherently dangerous in some way. Taking anything into the substrate is, for example,
I think that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that this began within the oil and gas industry, because the oil.
Technologies, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's for recovery,
CO2. It's only 2 places in the world that it's found. One is in Texas, and the other is in Scandinavia. The CO2 injected in the rock actually releases the oil from the rock. So it's the very fine parts that they can't get out is what they're using CO2 injection for. But to my knowledge, there's only those 2 places in the world that currently do it.
What?
But that is not proof that carbon capture technology is a good thing. It's putting in a ton of CO2 and getting out 2 more tons of CO2 to put in the atmosphere. That's what you got. And one thing not a lot of people realise, you want to put a ton of CO2 in the ground, actually have to put a ton of water, a ton of the third. Because it takes a third of a ton to get CO2 in the form of the atom. So, what is important is to preserve our fossil fuels and not inject carbon dioxide into the ground.
Yeah, which is why it's crazy that
They do that for renewables.
Yeah, it's crazy that they talk about Arctic oil, or they talk about, oh, when climate change happens, it'll open up oil reserves. It's a very twisted logic, which so many people are putting, a lot of
So
emphasis on.
Northwest Passage is now free year round. It's actually saving carbon emissions. Ships like that.
We've got global financial markets now putting it on cable across the I-3 passage to save themselves a third of a second getting between markets as they can make money on that. This is costing many billions of dollars to do that. They can find an economic reason to do that. They can't find a reason to save lives.
But like, there will be economic benefits from climate change, but if you weigh them up on a scale next to the economic costs, it's an absurd difference. Like I say, Russia's pretty happy about some of these developments, but Russia's got also a lot to lose as well. If food production in other parts of the world collapse and they can't import it, who knows? There are lots of risks as well as these very few number of opportunities. Are there any more questions? All right, well, I think we've had a great chat. I've really enjoyed that. I've learned quite a few things. That was really good. Let's keep the conversation going. I think we're going to have a network, maybe mingle now. But otherwise, you've also got my contact details here. So please do stay in touch. Thank you for coming out tonight. Is that one last comment? So this here has been a pilot for me, doing it here in Manfred. I wanted to start in my home community because I feel that's a nice safe space to be doing this. I have done this kind of stuff at the university where I've worked, but whilst I'm here, I've also tried to have a few other chats. So I've talked with some NGO, like I talked this weekend for 350, which is a, what do they call it? They're not an NGO, they're a civil society group. But also I talked with the West Australian Local Government Association this week.
Yeah, so I guess that is again that networking on a bigger and bigger scale, globally is some impact.
That's why I wanted to bring back what I've learned here. I'm not saying that people here aren't doing great things and aren't discussing these same things, but I saw somewhere where I could make a contribution, and that's what I did. And by coming here as well tonight, you've not just done something passive, you've also made a contribution. And it's something that we can all take forward and begin to find some new opportunities, support people doing good ideas or come up with ideas about it.
I think of these recorded so that, because that's the other thing, these things could be being through various centres that people can't actually get to, especially from regional places.
Yeah, if I had more time, I would love to go out to regional WA, definitely.